There we go. And we'll be recording.
Yes, welcome everyone. As Director of Communications just advised, we will be recording. I'd like to remind you at this time, please mute your devices. I'd like to take time to introduce our Executive Director, Chad Dion Lasser, so he can open up programming.
Thank you so much, Stacy. Good afternoon, everyone.
Hi, this is an interpreter speaking. I'm sorry. When the live stream started, I got kicked out, so I don't have any. Oh, thank you. Okay, we should be all set. Apologies for the interruption.
No problem. Thank you so much. We're excited that we have our ASL interpreters here today. Want to thank our Director of Communications. Want to thank our Civil Rights Educational Outreach Coordinator, Stacy Waters. Once again, welcome to our beloved community here at the PHRC. We're really excited about this presentation today. Here at the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission, when we're talking about intervening, being subject experts, or also just coming to a place solemnly and humbly as servants to listen and to learn, we don't simply put on events just for the sake of putting on events because it's a
Chad, you're muted.
I am so sorry. Let's start again. I just wanted to say, first and foremost, welcome to the PHRC's beloved community. We're excited today for this event that we're getting ready to have. Want to thank our Director of Communications. Want to thank our Civil Rights Educational Outreach Coordinator, Stacy Waters. Want to thank our ASL interpreters. We're really excited because we have Jessica Kim here, who's a person that is going to enlighten us, but also just really speak truth to power as it relates to the AAPI, radicalism, extremism, and hate that we see in Pennsylvania and throughout our democracy. Just briefly, I wanted to say this is not something that we do because it's a particular month. When it comes to really addressing all forms of unlawful discrimination, whether that's towards our LGBT community, whether that's towards AAPI community, our Jewish community, African-American communities, and multiple communities, we believe in doing this work in a collaborative. We also believe that there are individuals, and we know fundamentally that there are individuals who are outside of the confines of PHRC who are part of the beloved community. Jessica Kim is an individual who we admired one another's posts on LinkedIn. And we recognize that we knew similar people who are doing this work. And she's right now a PhD candidate working on her PhD in social welfare at the University of Penn State Social Policy and Practice. And so we reached out, I reached out to her, she reached out to me, and we said, well, let's have a chance meeting. And we recognized that our hearts were the same, though we're from different races and ethnicities. We're from the human race. We recognized that our synergies were the same as it relates to trying to address forms of unlawful discrimination, utilizing her identity as AAPI, utilizing my identity as African-American, and utilizing the umbrella of all of the things that we can do here at the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission. So Director Jung and I had a meeting with her and some esteemed colleagues, and we continue to have conversations, and it led to this. And so once again, radicalism, extremism, and the challenges that we're seeing in Pennsylvania and in our democracy is something that all of us should be concerned about. We ring the alarm, but we just don't ring the alarm. We need to stand in the gaps on behalf of all humanity. So once again, welcome to the beloved community. Excited to have you here, Jessica. And once again, thank you for the organizers of this event.
Wow, what a warm, welcoming introduction. I'm extra excited to be here after all of that. Thank you. Thank you so much.
You're so very welcome. And if you don't mind, I'll read your bio. I think
okay.
ED Lassiter did a great job already segueing into it, but I'll go even further. So with that, Jessica Kim is a licensed clinical social worker and certified clinical trauma professional with 15 years of practice experience in agency, governmental, and private practice settings, delivering mental health services to children, adults, and families. She currently serves on the boards of of Make Us Visible New Jersey, as well as Asian American Alliance in South Jersey, and help advocate for legislation of AAPI curricula in K-12, K through 12 education, making New Jersey the second state in the country to mandate inclusion of AAPI studies in January 2022. She is currently, as Edie Lasser mentioned, a PhD candidate in social welfare at the School of Social Policy and Practice at University of Pennsylvania, where she is the recipient of the CSWE Minority Fellowship Program Award, the Penn PhD Presidential Fellowship Award, and the Hal Levin Award. Jessica attained her bachelor's degree in psychology from Rutgers University, her master's degree in social work from Columbia University, and completed a postmaster's fellowship training in child and adolescent mental health at Yale University Child Study Center. She lives in South Jersey with her husband and 3 children. Please welcome Miss Jessica Kim.
Thank you, Ms. Potter.
You're welcome.
Ooh, is my volume okay?
Yes.
Okay. And thank you again, Executive Director Lasser, for inviting me to address your staff at PHRC. I'm really, really honored to be with you all this afternoon. Today, I want to give you a talk about, a little bit about what it's felt like to be an Asian person living in America these days. While I can only speak for myself, I will attempt to do that. And because I'm a licensed clinical social worker too, I'm always interested in the mental health aspects of a lot of our social problems. But, most importantly, I give these talks despite how stressful it is to address the subject of racism, because every time I do, someone always tells me afterwards that they felt seen and understood for the first time. So I'm going to try to use my personal voice as an Asian American person in hopes that it'll help more people, particularly in the AAPI community, to use their voice too. So this is Stephen Yun. Many of you probably recognize him from Minari, which was nominated for the Golden Globes and Oscars last year. And I came across a quote of his in a New York Times article. And I thought it really captures the essence of our racialized trauma, so I want to share it here. He said, "Sometimes I wonder if the Asian American experience is what it's like when you're thinking about everyone else, but nobody else is thinking about you." And, when I read this, I thought, oh, wow, this really captures the sense of our erasure and invisibility. And I suspect that if you ask any Asian American friend or colleague, you'll probably find that this resonates with them on multiple levels. It's this experience of not being able to find spaces where you're part of the conversation, constantly feeling like maybe you're hedging your thoughts and feelings to accommodate the needs of the majority, right? All the while waiting for your turn and realizing that it just never comes, trying not to take up too much space. Okay, so I'd also like to give you a little background too about who I am in the context of my family's migration story. I'm what they call a 1.5 generation Korean American. My family immigrated here when I was 2 back in the 70s. And this was following the immigration wave after 1965, after the previous ban from Asia was lifted. My father, he suffered from childhood poverty, as a lot of families did in the aftermath of the Korean War. He arrived here on a research fellowship as a chemical engineer, and he faced constant workplace discrimination, particularly in corporate America. And his way of dealing with racism was to be a workaholic, and he's in his late 70s now, and he still is working, and he continues to hit that bamboo ceiling. My mom, she grew up in a wealthy family, but after marrying my dad and immigrating here, her life changed drastically. She worked in a lot of random service jobs while my dad was a graduate student for many years. My mom is a firecracker. She is very opinionated about what's right and wrong. She has a very sharp tongue, and her way of dealing with racism was to give people a piece of her mind in Korean. And she didn't care if they understood her or not. And that wasn't her problem, she would say. Now, my sister and I, we grew up in Ohio, Atlanta, and New Jersey. And although we didn't have a lot of money, it was a relatively happy childhood. But like a lot of Asian kids growing up here, we experienced racism everywhere, from everyone. We lived right next to a Black housing project in downtown Atlanta, we also lived in some of the whitest parts of Columbus, Ohio. So I learned at a very young age to get really familiar with that feeling of not really fitting in anywhere. And I share all this with you to just give you a little bit of a sense of my lived experience as someone who, has been here since the 70s. And this was way before it was cool to like K-pop or K-dramas, right? That was not the case back then. And it wasn't until I got to my 40s that I started to really critically examine my own racialized experiences and to really look at the strain that it put on my family. And so today, I'm invested in trying to continue to heal and help others heal and to break the cycle of intergenerational trauma and silence, right, for my own children and for the next generation. So who's AAPI? Right? Who's Asian American Pacific Islander? We're talking about a socially constructed racial category. Okay, it encompasses over 50 different ethnic groups. We're speaking over 100 different languages and dialects, and we're all labeled under this one racial category. And it's a controversial category, because on the one hand, it was intentionally constructed in the 60s by Asian American activists, right? But on the other hand, this category can serve to obscure the tremendous diversity, right, of real differences and real social, economic needs that are specific to different Asian ethnic groups. We're not all the same. In fact, I would say there's even deep-seated tensions between various Asian ethnic groups. We're certainly not all united, and yet this broad brush of AAPI is almost always painted with stereotypes. And so from the start of this presentation, I just want to address this because many listening right now are probably still grappling with some of these forms of implicit bias. And this is a picture of Seoul, Korea, and I share this because I returned to live here for 4 years as a military spouse when my husband was active duty in the US Army at the time. And we were stationed in Seoul, Korea. And what's interesting is that when I lived here for 4 years, it hit me. I realized here, I am not an Asian person. I'm just a person. Because everywhere I turned, I was surrounded by people who looked like me, and it wasn't until I came back to the States that I realized, okay, here again, I'm racialized as Asian. And that disparity in experience really opened my eyes. And it's made me more aware of how it is that Asian Americans get racialized and stereotyped into set narratives here in the US. When we're not given opportunities to tell our stories, these stories get told for us, and they go something like this. It's usually one of 3 narratives. One is, you don't belong here. We get this all the time. The other is, you're all doing so well. And then the third I find is, you're all doing too well. And at any given point in our history in America, Asians have been racialized into these narratives, and each of them is harmful in their own way. Last week I gave a presentation about AAPI youth mental health for my school district, my kids' school district. And one of the questions that someone asked was, why should we care about supporting the emotional needs of AAPI students when they're all already overachievers? Yeah. And so even though I was distressed by the question, it's always a sobering reminder of just how deeply embedded these narratives are. So this is my agenda for today. As we talk about Asian racialized trauma, I really want to convey the connection between racism and trauma today. And to that end, I'm going to unpack the deeper roots of this rising xenophobia, its ugly history and context. We're going to talk a little bit about the impact that racism has had on the AAPI community. And I want to say a little bit about, where can we go from here and why investing in education is the best way forward. Recent polls show that 1 out of 3 Americans are still unaware of the anti-Asian violence and hate against the AAPI community. So I just want to make sure everyone listening is aware of the relentless waves of anti-Asian hate that we've been witnessing and experiencing. And it's just been too much at times. And many of us have had to unplug and pull away from social media. According to Stop AAPI Hate, which is a national database, has tracked these incidents since March 2020. There have been almost 11,000 self-reported hate incidents against Asian Americans. And just to give you a little context, that is 339% increase reported last year compared to the year before. To some, it may seem like this anti-Asian hate is a new phenomenon, but if we look at our history, it becomes clear that these hate incidents are really nothing new at all. To be Asian in America means that you are seen by others in a certain way, whether you like it or not. We have a very long history of being hated here, of being blamed as being dirty, evil, uncivilized, stealing labor from white workers, being untrustworthy. COVID-19 just reignited what was already there. But a lot of people, including Asian Americans today, don't know this because Asian American history is erased from our educational institutions. So let's just briefly unpack some of this history for those who maybe have never heard any of this before. So Asians have experienced a lot of exploitation. This is a picture of Chinese laborers who worked under very extreme, hazardous environments to build the Transcontinental Railroad. And because they looked different and they didn't speak the language, they were really greatly taken advantage of by their employers. And this was also the case for over 330,000 sugar plantation workers in Hawaii who were of Japanese, Filipino, and Korean descent. And Asians started to become seen as a threat to white workers, as we see with this propaganda poster that says here on the left, why they can live on 40 cents a day, and on the right, and they can't. And this depicts Chinese single men eating rats in horrendous living conditions, right? Which is contrasted on the right here by a picture of this sort of morally upright and civilized white man coming home to care for his family, right? What this poster does is it justifies the exploitation of Asian laborers and depicts them as being less than human. Asians also have a long history of exclusion and elimination. Many of you have heard about the 1882 law that Congress passed, right, the Chinese Exclusion Act, which is the only US law, right, that prevented immigration and naturalization on the sole basis of race. This lasted until 1943. And in this sense, Chinese Americans were really the first undocumented immigrants. So it's like, what was all this hate about? Again, as I mentioned, Chinese were depicted as being a threat to white workers, diseased, evil. They were not Christian, right? They were, Chinatowns were seen as being opium dens of sin and gambling and prostitution. So this all led to an uprising of anti-Chinese movement, and mobs burned down Chinatowns, brutally beat Chinese people in the streets. It led to the country's largest mass lynching in our history. We saw this anti-Asian sentiment again with the Japanese, when white laborers lobbied the government to pass laws prohibiting further immigration of Japanese in the Immigration Act of 1924. And of course, many of you have heard about the internment of 120,000 Japanese Americans. Right? This was signed into law by President Roosevelt in 1942 after Pearl Harbor, right, to forcibly remove all Japanese to prison camps. And many of us are familiar with Brown versus Board, right, in 1954, right? This dismantled our school segregation policies. But how many of us have heard of Tape versus Hurley? This is in 1885, 70 years prior to Brown versus Board. This is a Chinese couple, the Tape family, who challenged their San Francisco school district when they refused to admit their daughter to an all-white school because she was Chinese. This was during a time when all Chinese students were legally barred from attending public schools outside Chinatown. And it's shared history like this that I think can help Asian American and African American communities understand, right, many of our shared struggles in the face of white supremacy. Asian women have an intersectional burden of sexism and racism that really you cannot disconnect and compartmentalize. We see this in the Page Act of 1875. And this required Chinese women, right, who were coming into the country to prove that they weren't prostitutes. Okay, they were subjected to abusive, dehumanizing, racist medical evaluations before they can come in. And Asian women, have been fetishized and exoticized in our history for a long time through the depiction of everything from our U.S. military sexual complex to Hollywood films and novels. And we see this today, too. We saw it play out in Atlanta last year when a man murdered 6 Asian women in their massage spa workplace. And then we heard local police officers explaining on live TV that this was not a hate crime because the shooter had had a bad day and struggled with a sex addiction. Every Asian American woman I know was outraged at this blanket dismissal and erasure of our racialized experience, right, in this horrific act of violence against our community. Right now, I want to just give you a very brief and basic level introduction to how racialized trauma works, particularly in our bodies and our nervous system. It's really not all that different from how general trauma affects our bodies. So when we're feeling regulated and in good control, this is what Dan Siegel calls the window of tolerance. We can engage with the world around us. We feel connected to people. We're interested in what's going on, right? And this is sort of like the normal range of stress. We all experience the ebb and flow of daily stress, right? As we're going about our day, we're meeting a work deadline, we're maybe running late to our kids' activities, whatever it is, we go through this. And it's okay. Our bodies are programmed to help us do this. And our sympathetic nervous system might get activated in response to stress, but then our parasympathetic nervous system restores us back to a state of calm. And this is automatic and it's largely out of our control. And we experience these changes in our brains and in our bodies, and it affects everything from our digestion to our immune system. Okay, it's normal. However, when we're faced with something that seems very threatening to our safety and that's perceived as dangerous, what happens is our hyper arousal gets activated and it goes outside this window of tolerance. And what happens is we experience something that you've all probably heard, the fight or flight response. Okay, we're no longer able to engage in this social connection with other people, right? We can't think as rationally as we normally do. Okay, and instead, we feel angry, fearful, right? Overwhelmed. We can also experience something called hypoarousal, something that maybe you've heard as a freeze response. And this can look like dissociating or shutting down. It can look like apathy sometimes. Okay, either way, though, again, it affects our bodies. And many of us are able to return to this baseline of feeling regulated at some point. But for many Asian Americans and other people of color, right, we experience something called racial microaggressions. And these are the daily insults, right, discrimination, marginalization, right, that doesn't really go away. So what happens when these things are ongoing and so repeated that we're not able to return to a baseline of regulation and safety? What happens is these flight, fight, freeze responses can stay activated over time. So whether that looks like constant fear or constant numbness, the chronic effects, right, of this long-term stress can have detrimental effects on our bodies and to our health. It's just anticipating, right? Even racist events will switch on our body's stress response systems. Systemic racism, everyday racial discrimination, being afraid of racist events can cause people of color to live in a constant state of red alert. And this toxic stress, it takes a toll on our bodies. And the sustained release of stress hormones, it can lead to a lot of different health problems: high blood pressure, high glucose levels, weakened heart and circulatory system. It's serious. This is a photo of pepper spray, a noisemaker, and a Kubotan for self-defense that Asian women were reporting to be carrying around with them because they didn't feel safe during this pandemic. And this is also a fight or flight stress response because it's an anticipation of danger. And this is whether you have directly experienced an incident or not. The hypervigilance that we're seeing seems to be across the entire community. Our window of tolerance that we were just talking about has become much smaller the last couple of years. And it doesn't take as much, right, to kick us out of that window of tolerance into these modes of hyper or hypoarousal. When I speak to my Asian friends and family, right, so many people have changed up their commutes to work. Many have never even returned to work in person. We think twice about going outside. We refuse to take the subway. We've been calling our parents, especially the elderly, to take, care, not going outside and walking outside alone, right? This is what racialized trauma can look like. Even before COVID, though, right, we knew from various studies that racial discrimination and microaggressions have adverse effects on health outcomes among Asian Americans, as well as other ethnic groups, right? The literature shows the impact on depression, anxiety, even suicidal ideation. And it also shows how this affects physical ailments and reports of poor health, right? And so not surprisingly, these mental health effects have continued from racial discrimination throughout the pandemic. And there's research during the pandemic as well that shows that Asian Americans who directly experience racial discrimination are twice as likely, right, to report symptoms of depression and anxiety compared to those who maybe didn't experience discrimination. So the impact of this perceived racism has a real impact, especially during this pandemic. At the same time, I also want to share some contrasting findings that highlight the group impact that racism can have on an entire community. In the summer of 2020, there's a youth campaign of Stop API Hate. And what they did was they interviewed about 1,000 Asian students all across the country, and they wanted to look at the emotional impact that all this rising xenophobia was having on young people. And what they found was that many Asian youth were feeling angry, disappointed, depressed. They were worried about their family. They were feeling scared, right? They were experiencing verbal harassment and various forms of shunning and degradation. But what's really interesting about these findings is that when they split that sample of 1,000 youth into those who did and did not directly experience a hate incident, there really wasn't a significant difference in distress. The distress levels were similar. So in other words, this rising Asian hate was impacting the Asian student community as a whole, not just those who were directly attacked. And this collective trauma, right, is also consistent with research coming out from Boston University under Professor Hom. And she also found that Asian American adults too were suffering from PTSD symptoms, even those who didn't directly experience a hate incident. So again, this highlights the impact of vicarious trauma, okay? And that it can play against, when it comes to racism against an entire community, you don't have to be a direct victim in order to be impacted by this. And this collective trauma that's both direct and vicarious, it's not imaginary. It's based in the reality of how the API community is racialized today. I just want to share recent data from a status index, which is a comprehensive annual assessment looking at the attitudes and stereotypes of Asian Americans. And it takes a representative sample of adults all across the country from a sample of over 5,000 Americans. And what they find this year, right, is that there is an increasing percentage of Americans in 2022 compared to 2021 who are questioning the loyalty of Asian Americans. We also see that more Americans compared to last year are blaming Asian Americans for COVID-19. And we know that Asian Americans are the least likely among all racial groups to feel that we belong and are accepted in the US, even for those who were born here. So, I think what this all really means is that Asian Americans are facing a real somber reality in 2022. We can't keep blaming a single politician, right, like Trump, or blaming the pandemic, because we have a new administration now, right? And we're in a post-COVID era, that the root causes are so much deeper. They're more systemic, and they're tied to a long history, right, of xenophobia and fear and othering of Asian Americans, as we talked about. So maybe at this point in the presentation, maybe you're thinking to yourself, well, then why is it that, until recently, you really haven't heard anyone from the API community talking about racism if it's so deeply rooted in our history in America? So I want to address that a little bit. Have you heard this term gaslighting? What is it? Simply put, it's a psychological tool, right, used by those in power, right, to invalidate and deny the perceptions and experiences of others. And when we're constantly being told that we're making a big deal of nothing, or that the conditions around us, make it clear that nobody cares, it can start to feel confusing, and it leads to self-doubt. And you start to think, well, maybe it's just me, right? And as Asians, I think we're racialized in ways where the prevailing message becomes that our experiences are not really racism, that maybe we're being too sensitive, or we shouldn't act like a victim when we're all doing so well. right? We also live in this time of, this post-civil rights era, right? Where we live in a supposed colorblind society, where for, a number of decades, American society has claimed that there's no more racism, right? We all have equal rights. And so I think for Asians who immigrated here after the 60s with no knowledge, right, of the historical legacy of racism in this country, have not been equipped for activism, right? So we just keep our heads down. I mean, what has been the alternative after all? And we're racialized into silence, I think, through this kind of invisibility. And I call this the double bind of Asian racialized silence because we get two conflicting messages. We're on the one hand, when we do say something, right, we're told that we're all seen as thriving. We're told we're not even people of color, that we don't have it as bad as other racial minorities, or that if we're concerned about things like our family businesses being destroyed or college admissions boards saying that we don't have good personalities, these complaints and concerns get politicized, okay? And on the other hand, right, if we don't speak up, it means that we're racialized into honorary whites. Our exploitation at work becomes justified. We're seen as pushovers, or we're scapegoated as stealing jobs or bringing an Asian invasion or bringing COVID-19 into the country. And so for many Asians, I think it can feel like we're damned if we do and we're damned if we don't. So the silence, I think, is both voluntary and involuntary. Either way, our own racialized trauma is never processed and there never seems to be a space for us. And this is what gaslighting looks like, I think, for a lot of Asians living in America. So how did Asian Americans get wedged between this rock and a hard place? Because we never learn about Asian American history in school, we don't understand the landscape of the larger context of race relations in America. So I want to introduce you to something called racial triangulation if you've never heard of this. This is a theory proposed by Claire Jean Kim over 20 years ago. We all know, right, that whites oppressed Blacks with over 400 years of slavery. But after slavery ended, there was a demand for cheap labor. And that's when Asians entered the picture. And whites said that Asian immigrant laborers were smarter and more hardworking than Blacks. They also said that Asian immigrant laborers were an alien race, incapable of assimilation, who could never truly be American. And so we are wedged in racial relations between whites and Blacks, and we got simultaneously lifted up as model minorities and put down as forever foreigners. So if we understand this, we can see that we can't overcome our own racialized trauma without understanding the larger political dynamics in America, and we can't uplift our own communities without uplifting all marginalized communities. I also want to say a little something about cultural differences in communication norms. I think it's another contributing factor, in why many Asian Americans have not maybe been as vocal about racism until recently. In the US and in a lot of Western contexts, we have something called low context communication. This is where you say what you mean and you mean what you say. It's very direct, very clear and straightforward. This style prevents misunderstandings, right? At the same time, it can also escalate conflict because it's very confrontational. But in many Asian cultures, we have something called high context communication, where problems aren't always spelled out. Here we rely on nonverbal cues, signals, right? This style helps people to save face because you don't risk disrespecting people, right? But the problem with it is that it can increase misunderstandings since the message that maybe you're trying to say isn't always stated out loud. And I think some people might misunderstand this kind of high context communication as being passive or weak. But I would disagree. And I'd argue that there are many different ways to approach leadership, right? Many different ways to affect change in communities, and that the loudest person in the room is not necessarily the best role model, as I'm sure, many of you have witnessed, right, in your own workplaces. And of course, these are broad generalizations that I'm pointing out in literature. And I don't mean to generalize Asian Americans. That would be counterproductive. But I just want us to be aware that sometimes these differences in cultural norms and communication styles can be a contributing factor. And I think these assumptions about Asians being quiet and obedient have contributed to model minority stereotypes. So I want to return to this model minority myth for just a moment because it's so important. Many of you have heard about the model minority myth, right, but maybe are still confused about why such a seemingly positive stereotype could be harmful. Now, I find actually that even a lot of Asian Americans ourselves still don't understand why these assumptions can sabotage the AAPI community in exclusion from diversity and inclusion efforts, as well as leave us vulnerable, right, to harassment and physical assault, as we're seeing now. This term model minority was first coined by sociologist William Peterson in January 1966 in a New York Times Magazine article titled Success Story, Japanese American Style. And what he did was he highlighted that Japanese Americans had managed, right, only 20 years after their World War II incarceration camps, right? How did they rise to success? Well, it must be due to their cultural values, their strong work ethic, their family structure, their genetics, he said. And what's so pernicious about this portrayal was that it was politicized during the burgeoning civil rights movement in the 60s, when African Americans were seeking racial and economic justice and demanding massive structural overhauls in American society. So in effect, it was also a way to discredit the claims that African Americans were making. The other, really important piece of this is the 1965 Immigration Act that allowed Asians into the country again. But what it was that it was contingent. It was based on increasing the socioeconomic and educational levels that Asians needed to prove that they had before they were allowed to immigrate here. So really what we did was we selectively attracted professionals and scholars like doctors, engineers, and researchers. So it's not exactly surprising that you would see relatively successful outcomes among Asian Americans at that time due to higher educational and skill levels. And ironically, it's this Immigration Act of 1965 that allowed Asians to come here was born from the civil rights movement that African Americans had championed. And over the decades, the pool of Asian American immigrants diversified, right? They were no longer, right, the scholars and professionals, right? But this model minority stereotype never went away, and it still persists today. I want to be very clear that this model minority myth is a myth. It obscures the enormous within group differences that we see among Asians. We have the highest income inequality of all racial groups, right? With groups like Indians and Taiwanese earning more than 10 times the income of groups like Cambodians, Laotians, and Burmese, right? We also have enormous within group differences in healthcare coverage and access. The groups like Tongans, Koreans, and Pakistanis are 2 to 4 times more at risk for being uninsured than groups like Japanese, Filipinos, and Indians. Did you also know that Asians have the highest poverty rates in New York City of all racial groups, right? And because Asians are the fastest growing racial group in the US, as our population continues to grow in number and increase in diversity, it is crucial that we dispel the model minority myth and start focusing on our individual communities. Otherwise, the needs of specific Asian ethnic groups are going to continue to just be obscured and blurred under this monolithic stereotype. Last point I want to make on this is that most people don't know that when the pandemic started, Asian Americans actually suffered the highest % increase in unemployment than any other racial group. Many people lost their mom and pop shops, their service jobs, and retail and food industries. Where do we go from here? This is a short list of recommendations that are being made by many API coalition groups across the country. We need to focus on education, changing media narratives that continue to pigeonhole us. We need federal and corporate dollars to support research about our diverse API communities, and we need greater community support and protection to ensure that bias incidents and hate crimes are being taken seriously and addressed. I just want to spend the remaining portion of my talk addressing this education piece in particular, because it's the most heavily recommended solution overall to combat anti-Asian racism. But I do want to bring up a couple things to your attention very quickly. I want to emphasize, we can't dispel the model minority myth unless we have better data, right, on specific Asian ethnic groups. But the lack of funding in social science research is one glaring form of structural racism against Asian Americans. How can we know anything about ourselves when institutions aren't invested in understanding our communities? Not one penny on the dollar in grant making or research funding goes to focusing solely on Asian American communities. We also see institutionally how Asians are excluded and sometimes flat out rejected from racial equity initiatives for people of color. We even see this rhetoric in some school districts, as we saw in Seattle, where Asians are not even considered as people of color. A point on the media narrative that I also want to make is that 50% or 58%, I'm sorry, the majority of Americans cannot name a single prominent Asian American when asked. Of those who were able to name someone, can you guess who was the #1 most popular figure? Jackie Chan. He's not even Asian American, right? He's from Hong Kong. #2, Bruce Lee. We desperately need a narrative change in news media, social media, entertainment. This is going to provide more accurate and multi-dimensional stories about Asian Americans to help us overcome, right, some of these stereotypes about model minority and perpetual foreigners. It's not surprising though, right? I grew up in the 80s and 90s back when they still called us Oriental, right? Long Duck Dong from 16 Candles, Data from the Goonies, Mr. Miyagi, Bruce Lee, Jackie Chan, Full Metal Jacket, Me Love You Long Time, right? The implicit bias on everyone's mind was that we were the Kung Fu masters, right? We were exotic, we were objectified. We never learned about Asian American history, right? We never learned about the contributions of our scientists, of our activists who shaped the country's labor unions, right, who are part of our civil rights movement, about the first woman of color elected to Congress, about any of our artists. We never learned that we had the most decorated combat unit in the history of the US Army, right? All these narratives were erased. One aspect of privilege is when your history is taught as core curriculum and mine is taught as an elective. And having grown up here, I can say that these racialized tropes and the invisibility impacts the way that you feel about yourself as a young person. It impacts how you feel about other Asians too. It can bring feelings of shame and inferiority. It can impact the way that your teachers, classmates, and neighbors see you. It robs young people of the chance to fully develop their identity when they don't see themselves being represented in their learning environment in a positive way. And this is why it's so important that we include AAPI history and contributions. This is where the importance of education comes in. Make Us Visible New Jersey's coalition group that partnered with over 60 other AAPI organizations throughout the state, right? We advocated for the inclusion of Asian American history and contributions in K-12 education. Why? Because we know that there's no easy and fast solution to fighting hate and ignorance. How can you change the fact that people fear what they don't know and understand? Right? Not only can learning about Asian American history help to mitigate Asian hate, I think it can help our Asian students understand that they belong here and that they help build this country that they call home. This is about ensuring that all of our students feel seen and represented. We know that this bill was signed into law by Governor Murphy in New Jersey on January 18th, 2022. We also know that a commission for Asian American heritage under the DOE was legislated. All of this should give Asian American families a lot of hope. I understand that your state of Pennsylvania held a critical rally just yesterday at Harrisburg, and that Make Us Visible PA is working very hard along Representatives Patty Kim and Todd Stevens to pass Bill 1917, which would legislate similar policies for the integration of API curricula in K-12 education. I think this is an exciting time for your state in particular, right? To join the movement and raising up a generation of young people who see themselves in the ownership of our country, whereas previously they may have been conditioned to believe that civic engagement is for everyone else, but not for them. I think learning about each other and about ourselves is the best way to build empathy and to equip our young people to become the next leaders. Right? The states that have already passed this type of legislation, Illinois, New Jersey, Connecticut, we all had bipartisan support because people are starting to see that this is not a political issue. This is a human issue. Yes, there are, naysayers, fear mongering about critical race theory, but I believe for a lot of folks on the ground who are actually paying attention and thinking more deeply, we're starting to understand, right, that education is our best hope and pathway forward. Knowing more about ourselves and our shared ownership can help us to work together moving forward. Another part of our education also comes in building what I call racial literacy muscle. It's getting used to talking about race. We're talking about race relations. It's not about becoming a race scholar or expert. This is about giving ourselves permission to think and to grapple with the complexity, all right, around these really difficult topics. I came up with a simple acronym that I found helpful. And so I hope that others will find it helpful too. And I think we can think about this like we do with any kind of literacy. It takes a little bit of studying in the beginning and a lot of practice. So I think of it like building a muscle. And this is my friend Angela. She's a fitness expert. She understands the daily practice involved in building muscle. So I want to invite you all to learn this acronym with me. So memorize comebacks. Right? Know what you want to say or do next time you're faced with a racial encounter or racist incident. It's always after the fact, right? When we come back, we're like, oh, I should have said this, I should have said that, or why did I let this person, do that to me? Prepare ahead of time. Maybe it is having, one or two statistics up your sleeve that you've memorized, or some sort of witty comeback you want to say next time, right? But having those things ready and prepared ahead of time can be very empowering. Understand your racial identity. What does it mean for you to be Asian American or African American, right? Or Latin American? What does it mean for how others see you? Educate yourself, read, shed stereotypes. We have a lot of internalized racism, due to all these stereotypes and negative messages that, we've received maybe throughout our lives that maybe some of us have just learned to accept, and start believing. So we want to consider letting some of these stereotypes go and finding ways to narrate our own stories. We want to call out racism. And when we make what was invisible visible by naming it, we can start to disrupt that gaslighting that we're so used to. And when we do this, sometimes we can give other people permission as well to start feeling seen, maybe for the first time too. Liberate your authentic self. Right? What parts of yourself maybe do you want to reclaim? I think for some Asian Americans, maybe it's taking back your original name. My original name is Ki Young, right? That's my Korean name. That was my given name, but I changed it when I immigrated here to try to be, more accepted or for people to just not have a difficult time saying my name. So maybe it's, claiming that name, right? Or maybe it is choose, if you're a young person, right? Choosing a career in something besides medicine, right? If you like medicine, that's great. But if you don't, what is it? Finding what it is that you're passionate about, even if it doesn't fit what you think is expected or what the stereotypes are narrating for you. And evaluate your systems, right? Learn to recognize inequity in healthcare, in education, in government, right? Ask questions about why things are the way that they are. Ask, is my community's perspective ever centered anywhere? And if not, why not? Right? When each of us is building this racial literacy muscle, we can feel more confident talking about race, right? And we can feel more prepared. And we need all of our muscles right now in order to make our collective body work in this country. This is a picture of my youngest. He is 8 years old. But when he was 6 years old, he told me at the dinner table that he hated himself. And he said it was because he was the darkest one in the family. Whew. that was a huge wake-up call, for me and my husband to the reality of racism and colorism, even in my own family and in the larger Korean American community. My kids have protested as many times these last 2 years as I have maybe my entire life. And while they may not have always understood, what we were doing or why we were there, I do this because I want to plant seeds in them. I want this to be in their DNA, that this is what you do. You get involved with your communities and you look around at what is going on with people maybe who don't look like you, right? At the same time, it's also important to gather with people maybe who do understand your lived experience, to share stories, right? And to lead with vulnerability. That can be very healing. And it can help people because sometimes you could be mirroring things for others that maybe they've buried away. When others are able to name something for you that maybe you didn't have the words for, there can be great healing in that. And if you're a spiritual person or maybe part of a faith community, I think this could be another wonderful place to start building educational spaces and healing-centered engagement spaces. And we're seeing more faith communities coming together, trying to build bridges. And I think that's the difference between relationships that are transactional, right, versus transformative. I like to end many of my talks with this photo because I used to think that I ruined the family portrait because I insisted on wearing my favorite shirt that day. I loved this t-shirt, but when I got older, I always wondered, why didn't my mom let me wear this? I mean, look at me and look at everyone else. But I realize now that she let me wear it because she had always spoken her mind freely growing up in Korea, where she was just a person, right? She was not a racialized Asian person in America. She was never conditioned to have to mute herself. And at this young age, apparently, I hadn't muted myself yet either. And so I think in that sense, we both had it right back then. I want to leave everyone with a quote from Maya Angelou that has really helped my own healing. She said, "You're only free when you realize you belong no place. You belong every place, no place at all. The price is high. The reward is great." So I think belonging, doesn't mean that you mold yourself in order to blend in with the crowd. Truly belonging, right, is being your real self wherever you go. So I want to remind each of you, no matter what you look like or where your ancestors are from, that your voice matters. So let's reclaim the parts of our real voices that maybe we've left behind somewhere and to start taking up space, all the space that we need to belong here. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Wow, I just want to come on as we turn it back over to Stacy to open it up for Q&A and just simply say phenomenal. And I think, what you touched upon, Jessica, is something that if we're all honest with our individual selves, we're all faced with acculturation, Anglo-conformity, and assimilation. And in environments like University of Penn and elsewhere, that Anglo-conformity really, really is something that we see on a daily basis. I found your presentation for me to be liberating on multiple levels. I remember when I made the sojourn on the campus of the University of Penn in 1999, a professor said my name and they said, "Is your name Chadwick?" And I was afraid for them to know that my name was a derivative of Chad, West Africa, adjacent to the Sudan. And I said, yes, it actually is. And I think it's because we come from environments oftentimes where we feel as though spaces of whiteness is the new book that Elijah Anderson has when he's talking about sociology, and he's talking about Black spaces and white spaces, and the work that Charles Mills talks about in the racial contract, the demarcation of space, who's invited into gated communities and things of that nature. And so I remember being a professor at Penn, and certain students who were AAPI identity would actually hide their last names. It's similar to the work of George Fredrickson in Short History of Racism. Our Jewish colleagues had to go away from being called Stein and Kaplan and Berkowitz and Katz, and ended up taking on names like Smith and Johnson, all for the purposes of trying to feel as though they need to be accommodated into the dominant society or whatever the dominant society is. The last thing I'll say, and then Stacy, please open it up for Q&A. I think all of us on this call should be very aware, whether we're Puerto Rican, whether we're people of color, whether we're white, that racial trauma really, if you're not focused on it, if you don't know what it is, racial trauma against the backdrop of the moment we find ourselves in, which is a pandemic fatigue, can cause higher rates of mental health challenges. And it's very important for us to utilize services like EAP. If you're in the faith community, to use your rabbi, your minister, your pastor, to find adaptive ways of coping against the backdrop of what we're experiencing as human beings. Life in and of itself can be a daunting task, just in general. But if you throw on there the extremism, radicalism, the racialized trauma, it actually can just develop into just a disaster. So just wanted to share that personal story to you because it really touched me. I wanted to be vulnerable in this space because I do remember a whole semester. And I remember an Asian American Pacific Islander professor by the name of Caroline Wong. She said, there's nothing that says that your name is Chadwick Lassiter. Your name is Chad. And she freed me in a class in 1999. Let's open it up.
I love Caroline.
Yeah, she's amazing. She's amazing. She's amazing. Let's open it up to Q&A, Stacy. And once again,
Okay.
Jessica, thank you so very much.
Thank
So I
you.
just want, I want to briefly just read a few comments. Martin Cunningham, one of our attorneys, said, use your given name. He said your given name is lovely. So I just wanted to throw that out to everybody because I think it's lovely as well. And I think there's beauty in embracing both cultures as well, just as a, comment, if you don't mind my saying, but I agree with Martin, your given name is lovely. And then Chris Young had said that watching the news exacerbates the problem. And I would agree with him wholeheartedly. Sometimes I have to take a break and I'm kind of having my position. I need to watch the news so I can do my job effectively, but sometimes it just can be too much. Lastly, Chairman Bolstein said that the senator spoke, and I apologize because I don't want to mispronounce the senator's name. So if you want to repeat it, I would love to hear it again, and then I can try. But he said the senator spoke at his law school graduation, and he's our chairman. He's the commissioner of the chair. I mean, he is the chair, I'm sorry, of the commission.
This was Senator Dan Inouye, who was a Japanese American who represented the state of Hawaii for, I think, maybe the longest serving senator ever. I think it was like 50 years. He was a GW law grad, and he spoke at my graduation. And I remember his talk was mostly focused on his biography, how he had to overcome a lot of discrimination. And he ended up becoming, the highest ranking senator in the United States. So I think he was the Senator Pro Tem. And also a guy who just people respected, for overcoming all of that discrimination and rising to that level. And he really was a statesman. I mean, he was a guy who understood that there was a lot of prejudice, but it still allowed him to achieve that level of success, but it took a lot of effort. My daughter-in-law is Asian American, and I've spent a lot of time listening to her talk about the discrimination that she faced during COVID, especially because she and my daughter were living in New York City, and just little things like the way somebody would look at her in a line, waiting to check out at a drugstore or something. And I thought how horrible that is, that every day you have to face these microaggressions constantly. And they just decided they didn't want to deal with it anymore, so they moved to a very rural area of New York State. And I wonder if you see some of that as well, that people are just getting tired of the daily discrimination that they face.
Yeah, we see this in varying forms, and if we look at it from a trauma lens, the fight, flight, or freeze, there's different responses and different coping styles, certainly to move, right, is to, I mean, in PTSD terms, that's avoidance, right? And that's not necessarily a good or bad thing. You're doing what you need to do to survive and feel better and safe. Some people have unplugged, right, from social media, just not being able to, I can't go there, they say, right? I found some people who kind of present with apathy, which I think is the most unfortunate, actually, is I think it's very self-deceiving. This a claim that I'm fine, like this isn't affecting me, and clearly it is when you can't even talk about it. So there's very vastly different ways that people cope and deal. I'm not making judgment calls. Everyone is coping in the best way that they can, but certainly it looks different for different people.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So go ahead, Kurt.
Okay, thank you, Jess. It was a wonderful presentation. I just want to, by the way, Senator Inouye, he was a wounded veteran too. I mean, he was an American veteran, which is just one of the things that he understood. He understood, serving his country. So thank you, Joel. That was wonderful. To tribute to him, and he is one of the Asian American heroes that not too many people know about. But I just want to say, a lot of this goes on. Even myself, growing up in the 60s and 70s, I wasn't allowed to join the Boy Scouts. I applied like everyone else. I was the only one that didn't get a call back because I wasn't seen as being American enough to be a Boy Scout. It was disheartening, and it's even built in within us. And I know, Jess, I don't know if you had this experience where a lot of us Asians, you see some people back in those days, we used to have our American friends, and then we had our Asian friends. And our American friends were the ones who were Caucasian. So we're using those types. We're so conditioned and traumatized to think that we weren't Americans. And it took a while through the 90s and 2000s. So where I'm even saying that, wait a second, we're American too. So those are the things that we've seen. But the history of Asian Americans throughout the whole country. I mean, we think about the civil rights movement, but there is a whole history that's coming out now where we didn't even have a bathroom to go to. There was a colored bathroom, there was a white bathroom, but there was no Asian bathroom. And you hear people getting arrested for entering any bathroom down the South. And we couldn't even ride the bus in many parts of the country. So many people don't even know about that. We couldn't even get the back seat because we wouldn't even let us on because we weren't considered foreigners. And that's a sad story. And there's just all sorts of stories. I have a 90-year-old aunt who worked for Stetson Hat Company. On her first day, she had to go through every floor and ask every worker if she could work with them before they would hire her. If one worker said, no, I can't work with you, they wouldn't hire her. So that's a sad story. And that was back in the 50s. So thank you so much, though.
Yeah. The other thing I would say is when people look at Tiger Woods, they don't see the Asian side. They see him as a black golfer who's a champion golfer, but he's half Asian. So you would think that people would identify him, like when you said, who's a famous Asian American? People don't think about Tiger Woods, but I would put him on the top of my list. And I'm a golfer, so to me, he's the best there ever was. And yet, for some reason, people don't immediately identify him as an Asian American.
That's an interesting point, Chairman Bolstein. And I think part of that might be that one drop rule where people have been conditioned to categorize anyone with any who is in part African American as all Black. And I think that comes from,
right,
history and how we've done things.
So
yeah, I would also say that's why I think it's very important that we control our very own narrative. So, I think Tiger Woods, earlier, Jessica, you said, the catch-22 is damn if you do, damn if you don't. And a lot of the work of Howard Stevenson and Margaret Bill Spencer speaks to catch-33, which psychologically is damn if you do, damn if you don't, you're just plain damned. And so in the African-American community, there were individuals who they thought that Tiger Woods was negating his Blackness. He wasn't. He was saying, I don't want to negate my mother. And I want people to recognize who my mother is in context. And so you see that in Mariah Carey, you see that in biracial individuals like Holly Berry, you see that in the former Atlanta Braves and New York Yankees baseball fielder, David Justice. You see that with Patrick Mahomes. I think that whoever we are the ones that should be able to identify ourselves for who we see ourselves and that identity and that contrast. And then also, I think that we have to do a better job with teaching people protective factors so that people don't attack you for what you've decided to do. Not maybe in this space, but when I've told the story about, for a whole entire, almost half a year on the campus of University of Penn, I let people call me Chadwick. People who knew me, they was just like, well, why did you do that? But unless you're in that context, and once again, back to a lot of Jewish colleagues I've had, not wanting to be discriminated against because of anti-Semitism and changing their last names, not so much to ascend to another social status or class status, but to actually survive. And so I think that once again, we define who we are for ourselves and not the society. Is all of the work of Beverly Tatum, why are all the Black children sitting together in the cafeteria table with the Carlisle School, where individuals allowed themselves, not because they had to, but because of the forcedness of and the viciousness of racism, to not wear their Native American indigenous costumes or culture. And so we're kind of more Americanized. And so I just think, once again, everything that Kurt is saying, everything that Chairman Bolstein is saying, that Stacy is saying, and we still have a little bit more time. We still have 55 people here. If anyone wants to step into the beloved community, put something in the chat or ask a question directly to Jessica Kim, please do. And it's not scripted, it's fluid, it's organic, it's authentic. And if not, then we can all just end right now. But if there are some questions, please feel free, or some comments, please feel free. We have this moment. It's a very, very sacred moment.
I have a comment, Edie Lassiter. I just found it interesting, Ms. Kim, when you commented about Jackie Chan not being Asian American. I think there's a lot of confusion as what the definition is.
My understanding is he's from Hong Kong and he lives and works in Hong Kong. I don't think he would identify as American. I mean, I could be wrong, but that's my understanding.
You're absolutely right. He identifies as being part of the People's Republic of China. It's Chinese China, even though he's from Hong Kong. So he's been very supportive of President Xi, and he just, it doesn't matter. He certainly is not Hong Kong from British Hong Kong, but he identifies the support of being a China person who's a citizen of China, and not Chinese American.
Thank you. I think that's important for people when we're trying to identify protected classes, to have that correct. And I know we've had dialogue around that. So when you said that, that's what spoke to me when you talked about him not actually being Asian American. So thank you. And thank you, Kurt. So I don't see any other comments other than just high regards to your training. I think it was great. I think it's timely, especially because of what has occurred in Buffalo and I believe Laguna Woods, California it was. I think that education is key, and you've definitely educated us today. So thank you for that.
One question I have is I'm always troubled when people are stereotyped. But you mentioned that the stereotype that people tend to have about Asian Americans is that they study really hard, and that they're really hard workers, and they want to achieve a certain level of success. And so the question is that considered a stereotype when those things are positives, okay, as opposed to the negative stereotypes that people have that show their prejudice? I mean, is it considered prejudice to view Asian Americans in a positive way, or should we just and what can we do to eliminate that prejudice, that stereotype that people tend to have?
Sure. So just to reiterate some of the points in the presentation, this is about not making assumptions about people that we do not know. And that even if these assumptions seem positive, they can have unintended consequences. And
Right.
some of those unintended consequences can look like assuming that Asian Americans don't have any needs. So the example I gave was I gave a presentation for my children's school district last week on the mental health needs of AAPI students. And the question was, why should we care about this when Asian American students are overachievers? It was such a ridiculous question. If you're an overachiever, you don't have mental health needs. And yet this is what happens. This is what happens when we make these blanket assumptions about people.
And that could open the door
I'm
for
sorry.
a curious
That-
child. Try them. Even if your alcohol is kept safely, is that the case at the friend's house hosting the sleepover? Find out.
So
Start
just
the
to reiterate
conversation.
also, again, I think one of the most important things we could do is to start to disaggregate data on Asian American communities, because we're not all a monolith. As I said before, we have over 50 different ethnic groups who speak over 100 different languages, and there's no funding to research our communities. And so we need more data to look specifically at different groups. If we don't do that, we can't know what the needs are of our communities. I mean, the needs of Korean American communities are not the same as the needs of, say, the Indian American community, right? And so on and so forth. And yet, as long as we're all seen as all the same, no one cares. No one thinks that we deserve anything. No one pays any attention. No one is directing any resources our way. Does that make sense? That's the unintended consequence of assuming that just because you're Asian, you're doing great. That is why it is so, and that's why it's so pernicious, because it's such a tricky thing. It's a very tricky thing to understand that.
Yeah, and just to add to that, if you don't mind, I think the harm is, what if you're not considered the model minority Asian person? So then-
Exactly. Thank you, Ms. Waters.
You're very
Absolutely.
welcome.
Absolutely. And we see this on mental health research in API youth who struggle with a lot of mental health issues. It's what happens when you are not that straight A student.
Right.
Oh my gosh, I'm a failure. What am I going to do with my life? Right. The utter disappointment, not just from your parents, but society at large. Teachers look at you like, what's wrong with you? Right. Why can't you be like all the other Asian kids? Something's up with you. Right. That is what happens. And it leads to all sorts of other ramifications that are very harmful.
Right.
So again, on behalf of the entire commission and our guests, we want to thank you for that stellar presentation. I feel like I know more, and we'd love to have you back. So with that, we will conclude our presentation. And thank you again, Ms. Kim.
Thank you so much, everyone, for having me. It's my honor and privilege to be here today.